museum in Berlin stands a gate of glazed blue brick, lined with golden lions and dragons that once guarded the most feared city on earth. It was pulled from the ground in pieces, reassembled thousands of miles from where it was built, the last surviving fragment of a capital that no longer exists. The man who built it ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the edge of Egypt. He is remembered in different traditions as a master builder, a divine instrument of punishment, and a madman who crawled on all fours like a beast. Only one of those reputations comes from his own mouth. Somewhere beneath the dust of modern Iraq lies a stack of clay cylinders, each one covered in cuneiform script, written in the voice of a king who never doubted his own greatness. He lists his temples, he lists his canals, he lists the height of his walls down to the cubit. He boasts about gates plated in bronze and gods rehoused in gold. He never once mentions a garden. For over 2,000 years, the world has remembered Nebuchadnezzar II as the man who built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower of green terraces rising out of the desert, watered by some impossible machine, built to ease the homesickness of a foreign queen. It is one of the most famous architectural legends in human history, and the king who supposedly built it never wrote it down. That is not the only silence in his story. The same Bible that calls him an instrument of divine punishment also says he was struck down by his own pride, that he lost his mind, grew claws and fur, and lived like an animal in the fields for 7 years. Babylon's own scribes recorded nothing of this either. 2 of the most famous stories ever told about this king may not actually belong to him at all. Somewhere between the inscriptions he left and the stories others told about him, a different king is hiding. And the closer you look at the gap between them, the less certain his real legacy becomes. This is a film about that gap between the Nebuchadnezzar who ruled the most powerful empire on earth and the Nebuchadnezzar that history, centuries later, needed him to become. The legend is seductive because it is romantic. A king so devoted to a homesick wife that he reshapes nature itself, stacking terraces of imported trees and flowering vines high above the Babylonian plain, irrigated by a hidden system of pumps and channels that seemed to ancient eyes almost magical. The writers who described this garden were not Babylonian. They were Greek and Roman, writing centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Berossus, whose work survives only in quotations by the historian Josephus, along with Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, none of them ever saw the gardens themselves. They were retelling a story that was already old by the time it reached them, and the details they passed down do not even agree. Diodorus credits the gardens to an unnamed Assyrian queen. Other accounts attribute them to Nebuchadnezzar acting for a wife from the mountains of Media, homesick for the green hills she had left behind. The legend was already drifting before anyone wrote it down. When German archaeologist Robert Koldewey spent decades excavating Babylon in the early 20th century, he searched for physical evidence of the gardens. Near the southern palace, he uncovered a structure with unusually thick walls and vaulted chambers, along with a well containing what may have been a mechanism for lifting water, details that seemed to match the ancient descriptions closely enough that Koldewey believed he had found the foundation of the gardens themselves. Other archaeologists were never convinced. The structure has just as easily been interpreted as storerooms or administrative offices, and nothing recovered from the site. No inscription, no relief, no administrative record explicitly identifies it as a garden. This is strange, because Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions are not modest. He documented his building projects with obsessive, almost bureaucratic pride. If he had built a wonder capable of astonishing the ancient world, why would the one source most likely to brag about it stay completely silent? To understand why this gap matters, you have to understand the world Nebuchadnezzar inherited. For nearly 3 centuries, the Assyrian Empire had ruled Mesopotamia through terror, deporting rebellious populations and crushing uprisings with calculated brutality. By the late 7th century BCE, that empire was buckling under the weight of its own conquests. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, was a Babylonian general who turned rebellion into revolution. Allied with Cyaxares and the Medes, he led the campaign that finally broke Assyrian power, culminating in the sack of Nineveh in 612 BCE, a city so dominant for so long that its destruction stunned the ancient world. Even after Nineveh burned, Assyrian remnants fought on for years before being extinguished completely, leaving a vacuum that Egypt rushed to fill in the Levant. While still crown prince, Nebuchadnezzar led Babylonian forces against Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish, crushing what remained of organized resistance to Babylonian expansion and securing control over Syria and the Levant. Within that same year, his father died, and he became king of the most formidable empire in the Near East. He inherited not just a throne, but a project to make Babylon the undisputed center of the civilized world, a city so magnificent that no one could imagine challenging it again. The Ishtar Gate, glazed in blue brick and lined with sculpted lions, dragons, and bulls. The processional way, where statues of the gods were paraded each year during the Akitu festival, the ceremony in which a Babylonian king ritually grasped the hands of Marduk's statue to renew his right to rule, a ritual that mattered more than it sounds, because a king who could not perform it was a king whose legitimacy was in question. The restoration of the great ziggurat at the heart of the city, a step tower later generations would associate with the biblical story of Babel. Every wall, every gate, every temple was propaganda built in brick. It told the world and the gods that Babylon's king was chosen, capable, and permanent. A garden would have fit that message perfectly. So why is it missing? While Babylon rose, smaller kingdoms paid for it. Among them was Judah, a small but strategically placed kingdom caught between the ambitions of Egypt and Babylon. Ruled by kings who kept gambling on the wrong side, King Jehoiakim had originally submitted to Babylonian authority after Carchemish, but shifted his loyalty back toward Egypt when it seemed politically convenient, despite repeated warnings from the prophet Jeremiah that defying Babylon would end in catastrophe. The first time Judah rebelled, Nebuchadnezzar's army marched on Jerusalem in 597 BCE. The city surrendered before total destruction, but the cost was still severe. King Jehoiachin, along with thousands of nobles, craftsmen, and skilled workers, was deported to Babylon. Among those taken in this first wave was a young priest named Ezekiel, who would go on to write some of the most vivid prophetic literature of the exile from Babylonian soil itself. This deportation is confirmed independently by both the Babylonian Chronicles and the biblical Book of Kings, a rare moment where Babylonian and Judean sources agree almost exactly on what happened. A new puppet king, Zedekiah, was installed. Encouraged by promises of support from the Egyptian pharaoh Hophra, he rebelled anyway. This time, Nebuchadnezzar did not show restraint. After a siege lasting roughly a year and a half, during which the city reportedly endured severe famine, Jerusalem fell in 587 or 586 BCE. The temple built by Solomon, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, was burned to the ground. According to the biblical account, Zedekiah's sons were executed in front of him at Riblah before his own eyes were put out. The final image he was allowed to see being the death of his children. Much of the surviving population was marched into exile, while a Judean governor named Gedaliah, installed to administer what remained, was assassinated within months by his own countrymen. This event, not a garden, not a myth, is the most historically certain thing Nebuchadnezzar ever did. It created the Babylonian captivity, a trauma so significant it reshaped an entire religious tradition, pushing scattered communities toward new forms of worship and identity that would outlast the empire that caused them. It cemented his name forever as both conqueror and destroyer in the memory of the people he defeated. The builder of wonders and the destroyer of Jerusalem were the same man. The question is, which version of him was allowed to survive in the historical record, and who decided that? Here is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, like the lengthy East India House cylinder, describe his construction projects in painstaking detail. Canals, fortifications, temple restorations, even the precise materials used. A king this meticulous about recording his own accomplishments leaves almost nothing about the one structure later civilizations would remember him for most. In the early 2000s, Oxford Assyriologist Stephanie Daly proposed an answer that reframes the entire legend. She argued that the descriptions matching the so-called hanging gardens actually correspond far more closely to a garden built roughly a century earlier. Not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, under King Sennacherib. Sennacherib's own inscriptions boast of building a garden meant to be a wonder for all peoples, describing terraces planted with exotic trees and an irrigation system using a newly devised water-raising screw, technology he claimed credit for inventing. Surviving relief carvings from Nineveh even depict a raised terraced garden fed by an aqueduct running on stone arches. Physical and artistic evidence that simply does not exist anywhere in the archaeology of Babylon. If Daly's theory is correct, later Greek writers working from second-hand accounts long after both cities had fallen into ruin and were sometimes confused with one another in oral tradition, simply attached the wrong capital to a garden that genuinely existed, just not where everyone assumed. This remains a debated theory, not settled fact. Some historians still maintain the gardens stood in Babylon and were simply never described by surviving texts, since plenty of Babylonian records have been lost to time and looting. But Daly's argument is taken seriously precisely because it explains a silence that has puzzled scholars for over a century in a way that simple bad luck never quite manages to. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar's most famous achievement may not be a secret he hid. It may be a story that was never really his to begin with. The Book of Daniel offers a second mystery, darker and stranger than the gardens. According to the text, Nebuchadnezzar was warned in a dream that his pride would cost him his sanity. He ignored the warning. For 7 years he lived stripped of his kingdom, eating grass like cattle, his hair grown long like feathers, his mind no longer his own, until, the story says, he humbled himself and was restored. No Babylonian record describes anything resembling this. For a king whose scribes documented nearly every meaningful event of his reign, a 7-year absence from power would be almost impossible to hide completely. The same book contains a second strange detail that points toward the real source of the confusion. In a later chapter, Daniel describes a feast held by King Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's supposed son, during which mysterious handwriting appears on a palace wall, foretelling Babylon's fall. Historically, Belshazzar was not Nebuchadnezzar's son at all. He was the son of Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who took the throne years after Nebuchadnezzar's death through a violent succession crisis with no blood relation between them. Some historians have suggested a possible link through marriage. Perhaps a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar married into Nabonidus' family, which could explain how the title son survived loosely in later memory. Whatever the explanation, two separate kings from two unrelated branches of power had already begun blurring into a single figure within the biblical text itself. A genuine clue to how this happened survives among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In a fragment known as the Prayer of Nabonidus, it describes a Babylonian king afflicted by illness and separated from his throne for years, healed only after praying to a god. The king is not explicitly named as Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus is known from real Babylonian inscriptions to have left the capital for roughly a decade, residing at the desert oasis of Tamar in Arabia while his son Belshazzar governed in his place. His devotion to the moon god Sin, centered at a temple in Haran, over Babylon's chief deity Marduk, created serious tension with the city's priesthood. The same priesthood responsible for recording royal history, and the same priesthood that, decades later, had every reason to welcome a foreign conqueror who promised to restore Marduk's honor. When Cyrus the Great eventually took the city, his own propaganda, preserved on the seeress cylinder, painted Nabonidus as a neglectful and impious king who had abandoned the gods of Babylon, a portrait that conveniently justified Persian conquest as divine correction. Some historians believe the original madness story may have circulated first about Nabonidus, a king whose unconventional choices made him an easy target for hostile scribes and conquering propaganda alike, and that over generations of retelling, far from Babylon and centuries after the empire had fallen, the story drifted onto the far more famous name of Nebuchadnezzar. If that is true, then one of the most enduring images of Nebuchadnezzar, the proud king broken by madness, may belong to another man entirely. History did not just exaggerate his story. It may have rewritten which king the story was even about. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, having ruled for over 4 decades, and having built an empire that, on the surface, looked unshakable. What followed exposed how fragile that strength truly was. His son, Amel-Marduk, inherited the throne and lasted barely 2 years before being assassinated around 560 BCE by Neriglissar, his own brother-in-law. Neriglissar ruled for about 4 years before dying of apparently natural causes, leaving the throne to his young son Labashi-Marduk, who was killed in a palace coup. After ruling for only a few months in 556 BCE, Nabonidus, an outsider with no direct blood tie to Nebuchadnezzar's line, then seized the throne, a king whose unusual religious priorities centered on the moon god Sin rather than Babylon's patron deity Marduk, never fully reconciled him with the powerful priesthood at the heart of the capital. Less than a quarter century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire he had spent his reign glorifying collapsed almost without resistance. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia took Babylon. According to the Babylonian Chronicle covering Nabonidus' reign, the city's gates were opened with little serious fighting, and some accounts suggest elements of the priesthood, alienated by years of religious neglect, may have welcomed the change in power rather than resisting it. The empire built to last forever did not outlive its founders' grandchildren. What survived was not the empire. It was the story, and the story was largely written by the people Nebuchadnezzar had conquered. The Hebrew Bible, composed and compiled in the centuries following the Babylonian captivity, preserved his name not as a builder of wonders, but as the destroyer of the temple, the instrument of exile, and in the book of Daniel, a king humbled by forces beyond his control. A different kind of bridge between cultures came from Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek nearly 3 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death, under Hellenistic rule. His original work has not survived. It exists only in fragments quoted by later writers like Josephus. Through that fragile chain of secondhand quotation, half-remembered Babylonian grandeur passed into Greek and Roman hands, where writers eager for wonder folded it into legends about impossible gardens. Legends that, as later scholarship suggests, may not have even belonged to him. Babylon itself outlived its own empire as a symbol long after it had stopped functioning as a capital. When Alexander the Great swept through Mesopotamia, roughly 2 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death, he reportedly intended to make Babylon his own imperial capital, drawn by the same mystique that had built the Ishtar Gate and the city walls. Instead, in 323 BCE, he died there, inside a city whose greatest king had also spent his final years inside its walls, ruling an empire that would not survive him either. The Nebuchadnezzar of brick and inscription The king who genuinely existed sits somewhere between these distortions, a ruler capable of both architectural ambition and devastating cruelty, neither purely a builder of paradise nor purely a monster, but a king whose true image was eventually replaced by the needs of the people remembering him. Power, in the ancient world, was rarely remembered as it actually happened. It was remembered as it needed to be told, by priests protecting a god's reputation, by exiles processing a national trauma, by foreign writers retelling second-hand wonder, by conquerors justifying what they had taken. Nebuchadnezzar built real walls, real gates, a real empire that briefly ruled the known world. But the version of him that survived in cultural memory was shaped less by what he did than by who needed to make sense of it afterward. Generations and even centuries removed from the man himself. The garden may belong to another king. The madness may belong to another king. What remains once the borrowed stories are stripped away is harder to mythologize but more unsettling to sit with. A man who genuinely did burn a temple, deport a people and reshape a region through conquest. A legacy that required no embellishment at all. Perhaps that is the real dark secret behind Babylon's greatest king. Not a hidden garden, not a hidden madness, but the unsettling truth that even the most powerful man of his age could not control the only thing that outlasts an empire, the story other people choose to tell about it.